Today's webinar, Creating a Digital-Centered Customer Experience Starting with Brand, will be presented by Ryan Schulz. Before we introduce our speaker, I'm going to pass it over to John Simpson, One North's co-founder and CEO, for a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Kayla, and thank you everybody for joining the webinar. I'm really excited about this topic and about the series in general, but I wanted to give a few opening comments about it before we actually got to it. So if you've been on a webinar with One North before, you're probably familiar with our model for how relationships are developed in relationship-based businesses, and that is the relationship cycle. And the relationship cycle, just to give a quick overview of it, is very similar to the marketing funnel, but it adds some very important elements. Whereas the typical marketing funnel ends in a sale, that's actually where a lot of the opportunity begins in the relationship cycle, because we know in relationship-based businesses that once you've actually formalized a relationship with a client, that's where the opportunity to build that trust and advocacy and ultimately turn them into a referral source for you becomes so important. So we believe strongly in the relationship cycle model, and we believe that creative strategy and technology can be used along the spectrum at the various points where your buyers might be experiencing your brand to create a fantastic brand experience. And as we know, that brand experience takes place both in offline interactions with you as well as increasingly online today. So 15 years ago when I got into this business, when we were talking about branding projects, typically the branding project was done up front. And then at some point we got to the expression of that brand and how it would manifest itself on the website. Things have changed a lot since then. And today, when we're thinking about brand, we're actually thinking about digital much earlier in the process. And the reason for that is that your brand is being experienced 24/7 online. 15 years ago, we couldn't always say that. But today, your brand can be experienced anytime, whether it's online or through social media channels, etc. So starting from a natively digital perspective makes a whole lot of sense when you're trying to develop your brand experience. So for that reason, I'm really excited that Ryan is here. Ryan Schulz has joined us as our Director of Brand Planning. He's one of the newest additions to our team, and Ryan helps clearly identify, define, and embrace brand essence for his clients, their purpose, and their value proposition. Ryan's background, he came from VSA Partners and Vosges Chocolate. He has worked on many brands that you would recognize, from Google to Sea Ray and many others. And we're really excited to bring his experience to One North and are excited about how he is going to interact with the rest of our creative strategy and technology team to bring great solutions to our clients. So with that introduction, let me pass it over to Ryan.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the intro. I'm super excited to be talking to you guys today about this topic. It's something that obviously I'm really passionate about and I have a bit of experience with. So let's dive right in. So a few things we're going to cover off on today. We're going to cover off on some basic brand basics and some what I call levers of identity. We're also going to talk a bit about the relationship between brand and corporate character. We're going to look at a brand planning framework. We're going to talk about examples of digitally focused branding, because what is a good webinar without some really cool examples? And then we're going to talk about the roles of brand, creative, and strategy as they relate to customer experience. So when it comes to brand, I think most people have a pretty narrow vision of what brand really is. They ultimately think it probably encapsulates something like a company name and a logo, some weird esoteric tagline, and then a color palette. And for most people, this is where it stops when they think of brand. And this is not brand. These elements are simply visual and verbal signifiers for an organization. They're triggers so that clients and customers can attach feelings to that organization when they encounter that organization in a communications channel. Really, what these elements are is they're the creative expression system of what a brand is. So really, what is a brand? There's a lot more to building a powerful and memorable brand experience, and it begins with brand strategy, where a great deal of thinking sort of needs to be done. Brand strategy sort of centers itself around, if you guys can remember back to business school, it centers around purpose, promise, positioning, persona, and then it leads to strategic activation. This can be in real-world context. This can also be online. Mostly what we're talking about here is online. And then creative expression, how that brand really comes to life. Again, the elements that we were talking about on the previous page. But really, what is brand? What is of emotional core of brand. And the big secret here is that brand is really what people are saying about you when you aren't in the room. It does have sort of some real-world applications. There are certainly some categories that people are talking about, especially when it comes to professional services. And what I found is that there are basically three categories of conversations that are taking place typically about professional services firms when you aren't in the room. And it's conversations around reputation, relationships, and intellectual property. And of these three, there's sort of one that's sort of most important to adequately frame the conversation around. And I think failure to frame the conversation around these three topics sort of surrenders your brand story to the competition and other stakeholders. So what is that one out of these three that really needs sort of extra attention? I look at it as reputation probably stands out among all three of these as being the most important building block to consider when you're building a brand. And really, what reputation is about, it's really about character. When you're talking about managing an organization's reputation, you're not talking about controlling a message. You're talking about helping to define and distill the overall character of an organization. So it's really about character management. And as I was preparing for this, I thought back to, there's a really great thought leadership piece put out by the Arthur Page Society. John Iwata participated in it. And he talks about character, and he talks about what the role of corporate character in sort of creating personal belief in an authentic story. And there's this quote from Abraham Lincoln where he says, character is like a tree and reputation like its shadow. That shadow is what we think of it. The tree is the real thing. And largely, when you're talking about character management or developing corporate character, if you can build belief and consensus around what the tree is, the shadow will always be what you want it to be. And that shadow really, again, changes throughout the day. As the sun moves, the shadow moves. As the seasons change, the shadow changes. But the core of what the tree is never changes. And it takes a lot of work to sort of build some consensus around what that tree is, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. So some questions to consider at this point in the conversation. What is the character of your organization? Could you put it into words? What do people say about you, both the good and the bad? Because that ultimately is what your brand really is. What role could understanding your character play in influencing the decisions you make around how, when, and what to communicate? And how can understanding your character help influence the rest of your marketing activities? So a couple key takeaways from this first section. If you build consensus around the character of your organization, you won't have to worry about your reputation. Character is built on passion and shared belief. It's a central building block to brand, but it's not the only sort of element to brand, but it certainly is that emotional core. And without a strong sense of character, really the rest is virtually unmanageable in the long run because you're just talking about activities and tactics, and we'll get into that here in a minute. So when we're talking about management, we need to talk about brand planning, which coincidentally enough is my title. I'm the director of brand planning, so hopefully I know a couple things about this. And there's this other really amazing Lincoln quote that I found, and I happened to find this really awesome picture that goes with the quote. Lincoln once said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." And really what he's talking about here is he's talking about planning. He's talking about preparation and strategy. He has the right tool in his hand, but if the tool is not in the right condition that it needs to be, he could spend 6 hours banging away at that tree and never actually accomplish the job that he set out to do, and he'll be exhausted at the end of it. By spending the adequate amount of time and investing early on in what that tool needs to do, you can be a lot more effective and efficient when you're actually trying to do the job at hand. And so when I think about brand planning, I usually use a framework like this to sort of build out the components, and this is also the way I talk to clients about it. And in order to create a fully formed brand experience, you really need to begin at the top and work your way down. So you start with the brand idea, the big idea for the organization, brand persona, the way that idea sounds and acts, brand strategy, how that persona comes to life in order to achieve an outcome, communication strategy, what we're going to say and when we're going to say it, and to whom, and then the tactics of like how we're going to say that, how we're going to push that out into the world. But really all that leads to the overall customer experience, which is the foundation of everything. It's really the only thing that ultimately matters because, again, as I said, that is what your brand really is. It is the conversations that are taking place about you. It's the way people experience you in real life. The character development portion really begins way up here at the top, far away from tactics, totally divorced from tactics, actually. And then we have down here the way someone feels about you, as I said. In the middle, there are all these steps, and occasionally, we spend some time as marketers building out strategies. Sometimes they're long-term, sometimes they're short-term, but a lot of times we get hung up in this tactical red line area, which is fine for short-term visioning, but it's really a terrible way to sort of tell a brand story and talk about the character of whatever organization you're a part of. So a couple of takeaways from this section. I think it's important to make sure we're considering the entire framework. When we're talking about brand, we're talking about telling the story of an organization. And start at the top. Don't skip steps. Don't skip around. Don't say I have these tactics that I am totally attached to. Make sure that when you're building out sort of the character portion of your brand story, that you're really considering sort of what are those values that you really hold dear. And I'm not just talking about mission and values. I'm talking about something that's sort of deeper and more at the center of how your organization exists, why it exists, what it's set out to do. And if you do that, you can create something that stakeholders can actually care about. And it's really about finding that big idea that sort of sits within your firm. And then lastly, beware of tactics that lack a strategy. Tactics that lack a strategy, pet tactics, things like that, are merely distractions and often get away from the core character of what your organization is really about. Now we're going to talk about this idea that all business is digital, especially in today's world, and it's kind of a play on the idea that all politics is local. If you look at the way we've engaged with our clients and customers and employees throughout sort of history, starting the history of modern business, going back to the 1850s, there was initially this idea that, face-to-face, if I wanted to buy a product or a service, I would just walk down the street and I would walk into a shop and I would have an experience and I would choose if I was going to spend my money through that experience, that face-to-face experience. And a lot of it was rooted in customer service. In the 1930s and the 60s, through new tools that were developed, mainly the television, or mainly the television and the telephone and the automobile, you could travel to the next town. You could find products and services that were available in other parts of the country. You could make a telephone call, but really you were relying on another human being to sort of pick up the other end of the line, the other end of the conversation, and have a face-to-face or an ear-to-ear conversation. As we got towards 2001, 2002, and the internet sort of became a prominent business device, that changed a bit. There was an ability to sort of have a storefront that was always on, but it still required, there was some context around it. You still had to go log in to the internet. You had to turn on your modem and dial into the internet and go to the website, and so it was contextual. But as we've gotten to 2015, and everyone has the power of the internet in their pocket, and everyone has access to your digital properties, all of them, all the time. You have this finger-to-screen interaction, and the interesting thing here is that something's been removed from the conversation, and that thing really is you. And so we'll talk about that here in a minute. But what I want to define here is what thinking digitally means. When we talk about thinking digitally here at One North, it means much more than just your website. It really means everything that flows through the internet. And that means communications that are often built for non-digital purposes that are applied to the internet. So we're talking about your website, certainly. We're talking about social networks, but we're also talking about thought leadership that ends up getting turned into PDFs and gets distributed via the internet. We're talking about email campaigns with content that often shows up in other places. We're talking about digital advertising campaigns, which may have a real-world equivalent. We're talking about apps and earned media, which is the sort of PR side of your business when you get talked about in the press. And we're even talking about intranets, sort of internal communications and the way we talk to stakeholders inside. And I think the interesting thing here is that the digital world has augmented traditional marketing techniques by making them seamless, right? If I want to have an experience with any one of the brands that you all represent that are on the phone, after this call, I could look at the list and I could go do tons of research on all of you and find out who you are, where you've worked before. I could find out what your organization's all about. I can get a really good sense about who you are or who you're saying you are. But is that really the impression that authentically sort of tells who you are? Are you really putting your character out there in the digital world for me to absorb, to get that impression? And I think that probably most of the time we find that the answer is no. And that means that you're losing control of the conversation, but it doesn't really have to be this way. So let's talk about regaining control of the conversation. Early on, we talked about those 3 levers of identity for professional services organizations. And I think everyone's aware that the world's full of competitors and other stakeholders that are looking for opportunities to take control of a poorly framed conversation and take advantage of it. And unfortunately, the internet is rife with them. We have a name for them. We call them trolls. And trolls exist in many different forms. They can be colleagues, and they can also be sort of dark, hidden corners of the internet. But a lot of times it's just your competitor who's willing to tell a different kind of story about you. And if your story is not framed up correctly, it's going to be really easy for that story to become manipulated. So let's talk about the new face-to-face. You know, our research shows that before you meet someone face-to-face, they probably already know you, and I just alluded to that a minute ago. They've probably already done some research on you and figured out who you are and tried to start to piece together what that story is. They're putting the puzzle together before they even meet you. Let's just say, though, that even if you get to this point at a conference or at a meeting where somebody hasn't had that experience, the very first thing they do when that meeting's over, when they sort of head down the hallway after engaging with you at the conference is this. They're going to pull their phone out of their pocket and they're going to start to do research. They're going to look at all your digital properties. They're going to look at your presence on social media, and they're going to they're going to flesh out the story about you. And then that leads to this, because suddenly there's this thing called LinkedIn. I don't know if many of you guys are familiar with these. For a while, LinkedIn was supporting this tool. They're no longer doing it, but you can still find examples of it all over the web. These are the LinkedIn connection maps. And really what it does is it shows everyone in your LinkedIn network, and then it clusters them by group, and it shows how they're all connected to each other. And this should be terrifying to everyone, because inevitably what will happen is I hear about your business. I go onto LinkedIn. I find 20 other people that I know that have had experiences or that have connections to your business. I'm going to call them first and find out about your character and find out about your reputation. And if that story is loosely framed or poorly framed, that person's going to frame it for you and tell me the story. So let's back up and think about that pyramid again. When we look at a process-driven approach to the brand planning pyramid, it typically places digital with the rest of the tactical deployments of the organization. It puts it in the same category as print, campaigns, events, internal communications, partnerships, even pitches and proposals. And what we're talking about at One North is that in today's connected communications environment, the process needs to make digital the lens through which all other communications flow. We're talking about seamless marketing, that always on, sort of leading to all the other contextual marketing pieces. And we're talking about making everything that comes out of an organization be seen digitally first, or be thought through in a digital way first, and then everything else comes after, so that it feels born to be digital, so that when things in the real world get photographed and end up online anyway, they feel seamless and they feel connected. And doing this, building a digitally centered brand and communication strategy can actually make this work for you. You can leverage the network. You can leverage LinkedIn. You can leverage that huge hidden web of connections that's taking place when you show up at conferences and when you show up to pitches and respond to proposals. So let's talk about character again. Let's bring that back into play here and what role that has. There are some signs that your character might need a little bit of work. Let's talk about what those are. Do internal stakeholders, meaning your colleagues, all agree on the story? And those could be partners at your firm, It could be, different members of the organization. It even could be just within the marketing team. Do all the internal stakeholders agree on what that story is, and can they quickly tell it? I'm talking like under 20 seconds. Can you quickly encapsulate what the organization is all about? Is it easy for those outside your organization to articulate your story? Can you point to at least 3 ways that your character is digitally demonstrated and not just described? Are you acting the way you want to act online? Does it feel seamless with the kind of interactions that people have when they come to your office for a meeting? I've visited a lot of organizations in my day, and 9 times out of 10, I have one experience online. I go visit their office, and I have a very, very different experience. The offices are beautiful. They're well maintained. The art is fantastic. But I go to their website, or I go to their LinkedIn page, or I experience a digital version of their brand, and it all sort of falls apart, and it doesn't ladder up to anything. Do all communications feel connected by a single strategy? This is often a very difficult thing to achieve because we get caught up in the moment of the day-to-day sort of requirements that are put on us as marketing teams. So let's look at a couple applications of digitally focused branding, and let's talk about who's doing it well. This first example that I'm going to talk about, I'm mostly bringing up for familiarity's sake. There are some great things that we can learn from it, but almost everybody that's on the call, I'd be surprised if there was anybody on the call that doesn't know this brand. It is not a B2B brand, it's Apple. And so I just want to unpack really quickly some of those building blocks that go into the top of the pyramid for Apple. Their brand essence has always been, and probably always will be, around this idea of iconoclasm, challenger of the status quo. You can think back to that famous advertisement that ran on the Super Bowl forever ago in the 80s. But it was all about challenging the status quo and thinking differently, which gets us to their tagline down at the bottom. And their brand promise in the middle is really about making beautiful machines that work easily for all humans. It's this idea that you can go to an Apple store, you can buy a product, you can take it home, you can take it out of the box, and it immediately starts working. It's charged, all the software is loaded on it, nothing needs to be downloaded. You can immediately get online and start connecting and doing the things that that tool is intended to do. And all of those ideas are sort of wrapped up in the way they present themselves online, and also the way they present themselves in real life. So when you think about their website, for those of you who are familiar with it, the website, the main thing that I want to talk about here is the website offers tons of negative space. Apple has always focused heavily on negative space because it gives you a place to think. It gives you a place to insert your own ideas and be human in relationship with this tool. They always use really, really simple language. And the nice thing about their website is it has created for them an incredible template to be able to build out their real-world environments, no matter what those environments really look like or what form they take. They all feel sort of the same, and they all feel seamless when it relates to the web. Their website, they use the same imagery in-store as they do on their website. They categorize exactly the same way. They add one layer, one difference, that maybe two. When you actually go into a store, there's a human that's there to support you, and they put the product in your hands. But outside of that, the experience that you're having in their website when you describe it, or in their store when you describe it on paper, is remarkably similar to the experience that you have with them online. And this extends to all their marketing and communications. This extends to all their advertising. These are the 3 latest products that they've sort of launched: the iPhone 6, the watch, and the new iPad. But the remarkable thing is they've been doing it the same way for a long time. When they initially launched the iPod, the ads look eerily similar. And why is that? It's because Apple has a really clear idea of what their character is, what makes them tick, and they have a really strong sense of design and storytelling. So some takeaways here about Apple. I think the biggest one here is do it right or do it twice. Apple was able to do it right early on when they were first launching those products that helped really define their organization, the iPod and the MacBook and the iMac. Understand how your brand strategy will come to life across all channels before committing to it. And this is ultimately, honestly, the role of an agency to help you objectively think through how your omni-channel presence will be experienced through all the design that you're building out to communicate with. Be consistent across all those touch points. When you start deploying it, don't make concessions. Make sure that you're adamant about the fact that when I show up in this place, it needs to feel the same. It needs to feel the same way that it does when I show up online. It needs to feel the same way that it does when I show up in person. And I think the last thing here is that the bar is really high and customers are incredibly savvy. And I'll talk about this a couple more times throughout the rest of this presentation. But the bar is high and customers don't discriminate between B2C experiences and B2B experiences, especially when it comes to digital. It is when they go to a consumer website and they have an amazing experience, and they go to another website when they're trying to work on their business life, and it's a terrible experience, and it doesn't tell the story, and it doesn't act the right way. Consumers notice, and they're going to notice more and more as we move forward. So who else is doing it well? I'm going to talk about PwC really quickly. PwC's brand essence is really around this idea of intelligent growth, so not just growth for growth's sake, but smart growth. Their brand promise is about helping clients create the value that they're looking for, and their tagline is building relationships and creating value. The main thing I want to talk about here is PwC's mark. It's a really simple idea, but their mark was really created to be digital. When you look at that logo, you have the strong, bold typography that holds up really, really well online and in print. You have this really beautifully articulated expression in the top right-hand corner that feels pixelated. It feels like it was born to be digital. It looks almost like birds taking flight or a conversation bubble. There's something very alive and interactive about it, but it's also very digital. And the nice thing about their mark is they use it as a design implement, and it works really well in a variety of digital contexts. In the bottom left, they use it as an intro to their CEO survey. In the top right, they use it as sort of the template for how they convey information. The bottom right, again, they've abstracted it to use as the cover for the print version of that same CEO survey. And then it's translated to real world in a few unexpected ways that really draw your attention to the fact that it was built to be digital. It has a three-dimensional quality to it in the bottom left-hand corner. And then on the right-hand side, they can actually pull it apart and make it sort of the way information is communicated. It becomes part of the conversation. So a couple takeaways here. Think of a variety of environments when designing a branding and expression system. Always try to think as broadly as possible because inevitably there's going to be that exception, but exceptions aren't forgiven easily online. Follow solid design principles, not instinct. Leverage the tools that you have instead of building new ones. I think for this, what I'm talking about is once you've built the right tool, leverage that tool. Don't continually reinvent the wheel because consistency is almost more important than it is to be sort of new and fresh. Some pitfalls of doing it wrong or not doing it at all. You end up with misaligned customer experiences. I've been talking about that throughout. I have this experience with you online, this experience with you in person, and this experience with you in print or in some direct mail piece or email piece that I get from you. The equity is not going to flow in a healthy, productive way. It's not all going to go towards the top. And ultimately, your marketing budget is going to get spent twice trying to correct the mistakes or overcompensate for the places where you're weak. And it's a painful and complicated process to correct. So One North really thinks about a connected, coordinated approach. And I want to talk about customer service real quickly again for a second. Businesses' practices have evolved over time. We talked about that. But the foundation of most solid business practices has always been customer service. But digital has created conditions for marketers and communications executives that is changing that. It's augmenting it, it's shifting it. And it's changing the expectations of clients and customers. They expect more, they want more. So what do they want? They want a customer experience that's beyond customer service, but holds customer service at its core. Clients and customers don't just expect great customer service anymore. They now demand great customer experiences that are seamless and that begin with digital. That always-on idea of having the storefront in their pocket at all times, that is the new normal. So just closing up here with a couple of key takeaways and a couple thoughts. Digital really needs to take the lead in your marketing mix. Clients and customers are not discriminating between best-in-class experiences and the rest anymore. If they're not best-in-class, they may not get considered. Bar has been raised for professional services, and we see that continually, especially coming from our perspective. I look back at the work that we've done over the course of the last year and a half, and the bar is going up very, very quickly. Failure to evolve will result in an increased marketing spend and or decreased marketing efficiency. You're going to have to spend those dollars in other ways if you fail to put digital at the center of your marketing mix. One North believes that when an organization aligns brand, strategy, and creative, it can genuinely express its brand promise, resulting in increased recognition, loyalty, and referral. We really have this three-headed approach, and it's not three separate, distinct practices at One North. We all work very, very closely together. Khaled and Nate and I are often sort of contributing to the same phase of work, and we're often sort of trying to jump ahead of each other to make sure that the brand is really coming to life through creative and through strategy, which is what we're going to be talking about as we move forward over the next two parts of the series. Khaled is going to talk about how creating a digital-centered customer experience relates to user experience through the lens of brand. And then Nate is going to talk about how the creative world brings that to life and tells the story of a brand through the creative elements that we talked about way back at the beginning of this presentation.
All right. So just a reminder, if you have a question, you can submit it using the chat function located either in the lower right-hand corner of your screen or within the green drop-down bar at the top of your screen. We're going to take a minute to collect the questions we've received, and then we'll be right back to start the Q&A session. All right, so our first question is, what is the most common pitfall of B2B brand development?
Most of the time, what I've encountered in my career is the most common pitfall is honestly buy-in, getting executives to agree on what that story is and what those elements really should be as you start to build it out. And I've often found that the way to get around this, the best way to get around this, is to tell a really compelling story that's far beyond mission and values, and it's a creative exercise, honestly. And that's typically the role of a brand strategist, is to take a bunch of these abstract ideas, to take the idea of mission and values, which still have their place, and turn them into something, a narrative, an idea, an expression that really encapsulates what that character is about. And you use that more poetic, creative interpretation of the brand to sell in to executives, to get them aligned, to get them excited. Again, if you give something a spine, you can actually care about it. When things are spineless, it's really difficult to care about it. So, I've often found that when you give that mission and values and basic purpose and positioning a spine, you end up with something that people can really care about and rally around. And it's much easier to get executives on board.
Great. When uncovering a company's brand story, what does that process look like?
The process often takes a deep discovery period, and it's not unlike the discovery period that Khaled and Nate often go through, but I ask different things. So typically, I want to do an audit of the competition, both sort of direct competition and then a more peripheral competitive set. And then I also want access to internal stakeholders at all levels, not just the highest paid professionals at the organization, but throughout the organization to really get a broad set of opinions. And then talking to customers, honestly, and non-customers, it's the only real way to get at what that conversation is that's taking place when you're not in the room. If you just talk to people in-house, and if you just look at the competitive set, you're honestly just borrowing somebody's watch to tell them what time it is. And if you're able to break out of that and talk to real clients and customers, and then people sort of that are just in the consideration set, you end up with some really interesting insights that can help sort of add some real soul to your brand story.
All right. So that actually wraps up the Q&A session. If we weren't able to get to your question, or if you have any additional questions about anything mentioned in today's webinar, feel free to contact marketing@onenorth.com. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.